So welcome back. We move into a different groove now, having had, powerful statements, a reflection on what it's like to be disabled and in Africa, what the implications are for setting up a Africa-wide forum, and we've had reflections from both the Commissioner and Tanya on the state of play, both from the Commission's point of view, but also from Concord's point of view in terms of what the key priorities are. We now move into a session which is really looking at the state of play. And it's a session that's headed up as, is Europe half-hearted or meeting expectations? So is it half-hearted or meeting expectations? And this is in advance of the working groups we're going to have, which Tanya explained earlier on, which are about coherence and looking at impact and what the direction is in terms of the global gateway. But this is very much about is it meeting expectations or are we at a dead end? And so we have 4 people, and I'm not going to give you their bios. You've got the program, you know the names of people, but we've got a mix of backgrounds here, and also we've got a mix of countries and continents. And it gives me a great pleasure to first ask Janet Zhou, who has joined us, managed to get the visa actually at the last minute. It was pretty kind of touch and go, so we're very pleased it happened. What's, just literally like a couple of minutes or a minute or so, what's your reflection of what you've heard so far? Just in terms of, did it make you feel, oh, God, here, same old, but has nothing's changed? What's your reflection on what you've heard so far?
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm glad to be here, having gotten my visa on a very short notice. My name is Janet Zhou. I work with the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development based in Harare, Zimbabwe, and we house the Fight Inequality Alliance Zimbabwe. So the discourse around inequalities is at the heart of the work that we do for social and economic justice. And as I sat in the morning just listening to the different presentations, I am very excited, I would say, in reflecting from the videos, but also the presentations given by the Commissioner, by the Concord Director, in terms of continuing with the conversation and the discourse around inequality by giving it a human face. I think in many spheres we talk about numbers and figures and economic growth and get to a point where I would say actually the economic growth, alcoholism kind of in spaces where we're just talking about, Zimbabwe is doing so well. These are the numbers, this is the GDP, without asking the critical questions when it comes to the human development aspects, how it is changing or transforming livelihoods. So I think talking about development, about aid, about policies, by putting the human story for me is quite exciting, and I'm finding myself in the right space and place where we want to talk about a Zimbabwean with a disability or a woman, both either in the urban area or in the rural area, and how we can build their capacity, how we can ensure that we deal with the equality issue from their lived reality, as was said. So I think those are my reflections, and I think it is good for us to continue with that conversation from the multi-dimensional perspective, the multi-faceted nature of inequalities, and I think it will be a good space and process even for the EU engagements back home. And listening to the Commissioner, I think there's a lot to hold accountable for. Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much. I think that I'm going to bring you back in, obviously, in a moment or two, but I want to get this quick fire reaction to what people have, but very, very important points, and that very significant one about actually how do you get beneath the skin of numbers and into the human face. Gabriele, can I ask you, you're with UN Research Institute, etc. What's very briefly, what did the first set of contributions make you feel and think?
I think they reaffirm what everyone in this room knows about the galloping inequalities. I think what struck me about the presentations, especially of the Commissioner and from Concord, that we do have something that's very useful, to put it very politely, in the EU, the commitment to the SDGs, to the Agenda 2030, to the Climate Conference Paris, to other UN processes, looking at the different summits that are coming up for the UN, because I'd like to make the point that multilateralism is actually the solution. But at the same time, because you're saying half-hearted, I think the half-hearted part is that the EU is actually also, in many, many instances, part of the problem. So it's wonderful that we have these projects, but we don't really have a programmatic, systemic approach to tackling inequality.
Great, thank you. Philippe, so I'm not expecting you to obviously criticize the commissioner or comment on the quality of her contribution. But from your perspective, as you are an advisor on SDGs and inequalities, from what you heard from Tanya and the video and all the kind of other commentary got from that kind of scooping out from the Concord world, if you like, the key priorities, what's your reaction?
Thank you. First reaction is a word of thanks, because and when I see all the commitment, when I see what colleagues have done on the ground, working, by the way, with many of our EU delegation colleagues in the various countries you visited, for me it's a word of thanks. And also of recognition of many of the recommendations that you put forward that we are actually also in many ways sharing. By the way, I think it was Kiara that was talking about training and the complexity and the need for training to tackle those issues. We are organizing this week in INPA an online training with all our guys from headquarter and delegation specifically on inequalities, and we will, by the way, share the material and the recommendations that you've produced with them. So the first reaction is we're really collectively pushing in the same direction. In terms of the substance of the key messages I've heard, multi-dimension I think is key, not only income, disability, human rights, gender, but multi-dimension is thinking about inequalities in everything we do. Not only about, let's say, health, education, or social programs, but it's true also for climate, it's true for transport, it's true for digitalization. Policy, I think, and to be fair, domestic policies are key, because we can do everything we want in terms of concrete programs. If the domestic policies are not conducive, I mean, there's limitations in what we do, but to be fair, also policies that we at EU level and international level are also promoting are crucial. Third buzzword was challenging, complex. But here, I think, for me, we can recognize the fact that this is a complex and challenging issue, politically sensitive, and notably in our relationship with partner countries, but at the same time, be ambitious by, it makes sense to tackle it, and what we do, we do it with a lot of ambition. And then to go back to Janet's point, people, because in the end, this is about people. Therefore, all the recommendations, and the Commissioner touched on it, so I'm not going to it, but in the end, this is also about public hearings, about public consultations, about CSO consultation on the ground. So those are my four buzzwords from this morning.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Élise, what's your reaction to what you've heard this morning in terms of, as I said to Gabriele and others, did you get a buzz out of it? Was it something that actually was reassuring, or was it the same old, same old?
Yeah, thanks. I think my reaction to that is that I heard multiple calls for action. I think we're all aware of the commitments and the declarations that have been made throughout the year, but now is the time for concrete sort of operationalization, and we've had multiple opportunities to make that happen this year. So that's what I really take from the discussion. I echo the multi-dimension as well, not only in terms of thematics that have been addressed, but also the diversity of people involved. That is something important, and the transformation that needs to happen at country level. So it's great to talk about the institutions and how they can work better together more coherently. We're going to talk about that a bit more. But how that transformation actually is made visible at country level and on the long term. So that's, again, I sort of take from what I heard this morning, the multiple calls for action now.
Excellent. Not part of the drill here, but I thought, you've had lots of people speaking here. What about you? What was anyone's reaction to what you've heard? Don't be shy. Hands up. Do we have mics? We do, don't we? Okay, I'm just going to pick on people then. What did you make of it? Is it Hilda? Hilda, what did you make of this morning?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Actually, I'm an intern from
It's okay.
in global health. So I'm also with EDF, the European Disability Forum. So it made me to really think critically about inequalities with respect to persons with disabilities, like the video that was projected from the president of the African Disability Forum, and also what the EU can actually do, like really being inclusive, not just helping people with disabilities, but actually including them in everything that they have to do, and also working directly with them and not just maybe overpassing them.
Exactly. Didn't you feel that kind of the issues that Idris played out were so similar to what happens to disabled communities in Europe and elsewhere? It wasn't as if just because it's in Africa.
Yeah, even here in Europe, especially here in Europe, it's being faced. Like, for example, when I started my internship, there was this study that was talking about female women with disabilities that have been forced sterilization, and I was asking myself, does it still happen here in Europe? Which is something that happens in Africa, but it's also happening here in Europe. So you also see that the inequality and everything also happens here in Europe, especially for people with disabilities.
I mean, the EU is definitely not an inequalities-free zone. Let's face it that way. Please, I won't take your job away from you. Let's move. What about you? Introduce yourself.
Yeah, so
And
sorry.
let me forgive me in advance for stepping over the time in the schedule. Great.
Good morning, I'm Francesca Ligi, working at the Red Cross U office. So the discussion is very interesting, but as Philippe just mentioned, tackling inequalities is also a political issue. And talking about politics, we also talk about money. So happy to hear the discussion about the priorities that has to be accompanied with political will and supporting budget to implement the actions, because we know that long-term programming can be decided years in advance, but then when it comes to reset the priorities or readjust to face the needs that we are facing in a long term, it's a really negotiating process that involves many stakeholders.
Great, thank you very much. Gentleman in the snazzy suit.
Thank you.
Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Philippe from the Africa Europe Foundation, and I'm going to take the liberty to ask a question, perhaps. And I would like to ask a question to both Janet and Philippe, actually. We're talking not in generalities, but we are eventually working on actual projects, Team Europe initiatives, part of Global Gateway. And I was wondering, question to Janet, what project, either in Zimbabwe or elsewhere in Africa, have you seen that has changed throughout this process, and has it changed for the worse or the better? You can give an example of either. And the same to you, actually, Philippe. What projects, Team Europe initiatives, or anything part of Global Gateway have you seen change throughout the years, and in a negative or positive way, and how have you reacted to it as a Commission representative?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, let me. Oh, sorry, I caught your eye. So I know you've already spoken. It's always dangerous to catch my eye. I do apologize. Please.
Well, I already spoke. I'm just very excited to mostly hear the answers of our speakers. So,
But someone working in the field, someone who you spoke eloquently about the issue of gender, etc. Was it inspired? Oh, no. I'm going to not put words in your mouth. What did it make you feel like in terms of listening to what you've heard so far? Was it something that you thought, okay, this is reassuring, disappointing, or I feel as if we're making steps of progress? And obviously, you're part of Concord, so it's a difficult question for you to answer, right? Right? Right, okay.
well, I think it's important that today we don't only talk about international cooperation and Global Gateway, but also all of the other areas in which the EU has an external impact on partner countries. So I hope that this afternoon in the workshop on policy coherence, we can discuss that together. So I think that's a call to action to all attend.
Good, excellent, great. And sorry, you caught my eye too. So I know you did.
Maybe a question.
Introduce yourself.
Sorry, Theodore Nguyen from the European Network for Central Africa. It's a question that I've been asking myself throughout the years of internships and now working directly with civil society from Africa. It's that question of why doesn't the EU fund directly organizations there and NGOs there? And how do we position ourselves as EU organizations, being the one that are channeling those projects and programming, and what kind of inequalities do we create when doing that? That's a question that I've been asking myself in different kinds of organizations on equality, human rights, development, peace and security. So yeah, that's
Really good question. Thank you. Can I just hands up from how many of you in this room feel that money should go direct to NGOs on the ground and not intermediaries? So hands up that the money should go direct to NGOs in Africa and elsewhere. Okay. All right. And those of you who think we should still work through intermediaries, be brave. If you believe that, both. You think both? So, okay, let me be challenging. We've just heard, right? Some of the NGOs that we've heard from, even Idris and others saying that actually it's the intermediary that doesn't get the money to us directly. You still feel that there's a place for both the intermediary and the direct? You all do. Okay, can we just comment on that?
Hi, my name is Eppo Mikkonen. I come from Finland, from Fingo, which is the platform National Concord.
Yes.
Well, I think both at the moment, I think there is definitely a shift, but very personal, very subjective. So when I've been working in countries, especially where there has been kind of rapid onset emergencies, it's really important that resources are going to the local organizations. At the same time, what tends to happen is the volumes are so enormous that not 1 or 2 or 3 times have I seen small organizations fold because they've been given so much responsibility and funding and no capacity to report and sort of monitor. Because if we're looking at the big donors, it's no mean feat to report to them on funding. So there's a risk there. So I would see that there's a process. It is, I think the kind of the end goal is direct, but to jump right in includes risks as well.
Please, it's great. I know you're meant to be speaking, colleagues, but we're here to serve them. We're here to serve them. Go on.
Just quickly, as was said by Idris as well. So if we want to, if donors finance directly organizations in developing countries, then the modalities must be adapted to them. It's not just, transferring money. The same system that they use with the European NGOs, they will not obligatory work with the local one. So it has to be context specific and adapted to the needs and the realities.
Gosh, there's a wave of discussion here. This is great. So pass it round, please do. It's here. Go on, go for it. Because this is about you, as I said.
I wanted to add that when it comes to intermediaries, and especially when we look, for example, I work on global health. So when we look about global health initiatives, and they always work, they often position as intermediaries between the big donors and the country level. We need absolutely to avoid duplication of initiatives. We need to avoid having so many intermediaries and interlocutors that it's really difficult to understand from the funding to the ground what actually arrives at the end, what it is actually implemented, what it is actually the impact that we have achieved. So it depends also, it's both, but it depends also on the relation between the intermediary and the civil society at the ground.
Indeed, a point very well made. And isn't it? You've already had one bite of the cherry, so I can't. So I'm going to make it more balanced because we've had not very many men. So I'm going to put a man and give him the mic. But before you do, I think the point you're making is it's a question for all of us, isn't it? About if we have intermediaries, what we don't do is question their purpose. We don't have an agreed definition of the role of an intermediary. It's too multifaceted, or we give up and we're lazy in thinking actually it's either to do with volume and capability, it's either capacity building, or is it good governance, or is it about, doing something else? And I don't think we're really clear. It could be multiple, but I don't think we've got a clear sense of what an intermediary is about. Gentleman there, go on. Introduce yourself.
I'm Patrice Léger, so I'm working for the French Fund for Innovation in Development. we want to become European, but what I just wanted to say that it's actually great and it's actually possible to fund directly local NGOs and local startups and local organizations. And we've had amazing results. In less than 2 years, we've now funded like 50 projects, and half of them are from NGOs, and I think like around 60 or 70% of funds actually go to local organizations. If not, the rest goes to international NGOs or research centers which are based in Europe or in the US. And we've had amazing results. I mean, we have like really small grants for local associations.
What's the size of the smallest grant?
It's up to 50K, like for prepare grants, which are really like early in the journey of innovation.
Yeah.
We've also had like a 1.5 million grant for the Shamiri Institute, for instance, in Kenya, which is a Kenya research center on mental health, which is, by the way, a great barrier to equality, actually.
Oh, I know.
Health issues. And they're actually removing barriers to mental health access in Kenya for the young. So it's possible, and we've been struggling ourselves with the French Development Agency because we're part of this big bureaucracy, but it's possible from the inside as well to make a change in coalition with all of you.
It's quite a story from within the agency. It's quite conservative to begin with a historic colonial past, and you've done some exciting. Share with us in the working groups, because I can't do it now, but I'm fascinated by how you overcame the appetite for de-risking projects, or actually having a high-risk approach amongst funders, especially those who invest in you, to say, we'll take the bet, and actually you got success. There'll be, not now, I can't take that, because they're going to kill me, and everyone's going to, really out of time. But Lady has her hand up, so you'll be my last contribution, I'm afraid. Again, introduce yourself.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Verity from HelpAge International. I guess I wanted to say that I think we sort of oversimplify things when we talk just about intermediaries broadly, and there are kind of valuable intermediaries, and I think you have to look at the reasons why and the roles that people are playing. It is frustrating, for example, from the kind of humanitarian funding perspective, that quite often governments will say, oh, like, we actually can't manage lots of individual contracts, so we're just going to shove all of our money into kind of UN agencies, and eventually it will trickle down to country-based pool funds through the UN, and we don't have to worry about that, but it will get there eventually, and we know that takes an enormous amount of time, lots of money's lost, and it's done for efficiency reasons here in the global north, not for people on the ground. But then, when we're kind of coming from a values-based perspective, we've got partnerships and NGOs who are kind of based here in the global north, yes, but actively working towards stronger partnerships with the global south and can play the roles that kind of EPU and others have talked about today. I think that's completely different, and we have to kind of look at what kind of partnerships we want and not kind of be simplistic about where there's going to come from. Ultimately, there will be different kind of routes, but yeah, we shouldn't be doing it for the sake of kind of the efficiency of the UK Foreign Office or whatever, because...
Exactly. Well done, well stated. Thank you very much. I hope someone's recording all of this, because the really good points are being made. I'm sure it is. Is it being recorded? Excellent. Great. Good. So thank you for that, because I think it was important for you to have a bit of chivying up, because you've had a lot of people speaking to you from here. So, Janet, I'm going to come to you. And the question that was asked, I will come to Philippe and others on that. But, Janet, when we think about where we find ourselves in terms of whether it's a dead end or an opportunity, give us your perspective on the Zimbabwean experience, but also sub-Saharan, in terms of how does it feel like being a recipient or other end of the relationship with the EU?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. And I am coming from a very difficult context when it comes to the relationship of Zimbabwe and the international community. Broken down in the early 2000s, I would say, when we defaulted to pay our debt to the international financial institutions, particularly the IMF, the Africa Development Bank, and the World Bank. And a whole lot of a context where civic space, political space started shrinking. And we have seen a lot of suppression and oppression of voice in Zimbabwe. And the international community, such as the EU and our other bilateral friends, and America, I would say, have taken a lot of measures in terms of how to ensure that we deal with the Zimbabwean situation and context, political, social, and economic context in different ways. And the EU has been there, and we are under restrictions or sanctions, if we may want to call them that, in trying to make the authorities respond to the challenges that we have. Zimbabwe is a rich country. It has got natural resources. It has got, I think, a very significant population that is educated in terms of human resources and all. And support from the EU has continued in different ways. But I would say that we have faced our challenges in terms of three ways around the conflicts, the internal conflicts, and lack of cohesion that we have kept on having. The climate change aspects, a big issue as well that has contributed to droughts, humanitarian crisis that we have faced. Then, of course, entered the COVID-19, which also brought its own challenges. And this has changed the landscape in terms of aid, development support, and engagement with the international community. We are already a country in debt distress, depending a lot on aid and development from development partners such as the EU. It disrupted, all these three C's I've spoken about have disrupted as well our trade, our investments relationships, to an extent that Zimbabwe mostly looks east when it comes to investments, when it comes to credit lines. So we don't have concessionary loans, as an example. And this means a lot in terms of debt-inducing aspects of our context and the climate change, the conflicts internally, and lack of cohesion, and the COVID-19 that we have faced. So we would feel like our situation in most of the cases is projected as a humanitarian crisis. And when it comes to dealing with inequalities, I think we need to also bring in the human rights aspect to it as we connect the issues from the humanitarian crisis that the people of Zimbabwe face because of the context to the human rights crisis. So when we are talking about ending inequalities, I think those two dimensions are very critical for the people of Zimbabwe. So with the international community and with the EU specifically, is to deal with the human designs of these challenges we have faced. They are very complex, but they've been designed by humans. And this is why we have such a highly unequal society in Zimbabwe, and I think regionally as well. So would see development partners highlighting how they have assisted the people of Zimbabwe, or even in the region where there are also conflicts, the same issues the whole region has faced and have been exposed to. But when the story, I'm always thinking that when the story is told by the hunter, it misses a certain point as well of the hunted in terms of their experiences when it comes to the aid, when it comes to the assistance, when it comes to how policies are dealing with inequalities. So we need to be thinking about the empowering nature of the policies that we have. I know, for example, in Zimbabwe, we have the multi-annual indicative program for Zimbabwe, which has got three very important pillars around citizens' rights, around the green economy and growth and all. But I think we need to go a step further in terms of political will, and the people here have really highlighted some of those issues, the funding models, as an example. How are we funding? How are we empowering? How are we dealing with the institutions that have perpetuated inequalities by telling a narrative that lacks the hunted's voice, if I may put it that way, in terms of of the experiences and the context in which we are in. So we need to be thinking of dealing with the institutions themselves. It's the private sector, it's the public sector, and then center the people in the discourse and in the narrative. So we'll continue actually to kind of disempower and put the Zimbabwean citizen as a victim to some of the policies, but they are also very empowering stories that we could tell, but there are also ways we could build that capacity, focusing on the different sectors in Zimbabwe. The EU has tried in terms of engagement with the youth, with engagement with women, but we still then, there are programs that have run at that level, but we still need to, I think, escalate the conversation and the support and the policies and the plans to a level where I think people have said here directly support the people themselves and avoid the intermediary kind of level. One, two, the institutional support for those civil society organizations and other institutions that are working within the sphere of the pillars that have been highlighted here. We always have a challenge, and I want to share an experience where, from the organization where I come from, ZimCod, we applied for funding from one of the EU member countries. We'd been told that the program had about 3.5 million for 2.5 to 3 years. And we participated in a number of processes with that organization or development agency in co-creating their program or their 2-3 year project. Then when it came to then applying for that funding, we were told that there was only $50,000 US, whether you were a consortium, which they were actually encouraging that be in consortiums. And the thinking was, with 50,000 for 2 years, where has the 3.5 million euros gone to? So I think the issue around the funding models and the giving with one hand and then taking with the other seriously perpetuates the inequalities at the end of the day. We didn't get it, but we are a coalition. We have over 134 organizations, community-based organizations. We wanted to do an application. We were going to empower those communities to report corruption, illicit financial flows, abuse of state resources from their communities, 57 districts that we operate in Zimbabwe. But we didn't manage to apply for it because for 50,000 over 2 years, that was not going to take place. So I'm just responding to the issue of the half-heartedness of some of these policies or plans or actions from the EU as a bloc, but also from the member countries. So I think as we review, we need to be very candid in terms of whether our plans and our policies go hand in hand with what we then do on the ground in terms of supporting the locals. We'll talk about localization, subnational levels, but is the resource really flowing to those subnational levels? You realize that there is a huge gap there that we need to deal with. So we still need to talk partnerships, we still need to talk about people, we still need to talk about the planet when it comes to these issues. I was going to give an example around the humanitarian and the human rights crisis as well. We work with colleagues in Mozambique as an example, the northern Mozambique, where there has been a conflict there. And the narrative was really a humanitarian crisis kind of perspective where you need to be bringing in donations and the like without tackling the human rights aspect of the locals in northern Mozambique being displaced, losing their homes and livelihoods and the like. So these are issues I think that we really need to deal with and not only work at government partner levels, but co-create as well with the communities, with the civil society organizations back home and in the countries that the EU has got programs in. I think I'll come back.
Yeah, please
probably
do.
with,
Yeah.
with some of the.
You've almost kind of tapped also into the second session,
Yeah.
second part of this is about what we should be asking for. So it's been really helpful that your diagnostic is actually helping us think about what you do. What I'm really struck by, though, is at some point, if you think about enlightened evidence-based policy making, you'd think one of the things you'd do is bring, let's say, 500 organizations that have been recipients of EU money and do a social, environmental, political, health audit to understand actually has that funding been good? Has it created sustainability? Has it created the right pathways, or has it actually done the negative? Very much building on Philippe's question about if there was one organisation you could think in this period that has progressed well or actually fared poorly. It's that kind of dynamic that we need to understand better. But you can come back to that about the example later. Gabriele, I want to move to you. Your agency has brought out the report, A Crisis of Inequality. Tell us more about it, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Janet for these insights, because they actually corroborate what this UNRISD report is about, also what Concord is writing in their report, what Oxfam is saying. I think there's maybe 3 or 4 bullet points, as it were, take-home messages from this report on inequalities and the crisis of inequality. The first is the analysis that it all basically stems from the same issue, which is hyperglobalization, the hyperglobalization of capital, the deregulation, these global production chains that are not fettered in by any kind of overarching normative goals, which is where the EU norms might hopefully come in, the destruction of our planet, of the biodiversity, the whole CO2 issue. It's all part of these global production chains or global value chains. We recently also see a militarization, unfortunately, even in the European Union, a very strong pull in the direction of taking monies out of social policy and the social, economic, political policies back into the military. And what UNRISD is saying is that we see this dismantling, this falling apart of what used to exist post-World War II in the form of a social contract, of agreement or social contracts between different interest groups, between trade unions and governments, between trade unions and employers, between civil society and their governments, between refugee organizations and multinational institutions, and these social contracts have come apart, so there's not this regulatory authority in place which could rein in hyper-globalization. And so the pitch we are making in the report, and I work both with the UN Research Institute for Social Development and also with Women Engaged for Common Future. The pitch that we're making is really for a new social contract, eco-social contract, feminist, gender, climate, just social contract. And I think that relates to Janet's point about reinstituting also civil space and the space for policy decisions of those governments that are progressive and for civil society in those countries that have authoritarian governments. Let me leave it there. Please read our report. There's a few spare copies for those who, like me, prefer reading printed stuff, and it's, of course, on the internet.
Gabriele, thank you. Thank you for being direct and to the point. We want to hear more about, obviously, when we move into that section about what could change as a result of that. So that's a really good diagnosis of the problem, but let's move into solution mode in a moment. Philippe, over to you. And perhaps start with that question that we got from the floor about, can you think of an organization that's been funded that has either fared well or poorly as a result of funding from yourselves? You might be far too removed from that space, but if you can't, then not a problem. But otherwise, give us your take on where we find ourselves in terms of whether we've got a faint-hearted approach or expectations not being met.
No, thank you. Not halfway, fully committed, clearly, and also fully committed to the call to action. I don't know if you want me to come back to some of the points I thought you wanted to raise, but in any case, specifically on the issue that because I want to come back to what we do to connect the dots. I want to come back to inequalities, to SDGs and Global Gateway, because it's not like there's discussion on inequalities somewhere, a discussion on SDGs that somebody else is running somewhere else, and a third one somewhere on Global Gateway, which might also do something different. So if I have the opportunity in the second round, that's the message I want to pass and show you concretely what we're trying to do on those three areas.
Okay.
So either now or later, I'm in your hands, specifically on the discussion about funding and civil society organizations. And you have Chiara this afternoon, who would be better equipped, I think, to reply to these questions based on your working group. But I mean, two things. Not to flag this as an excuse, but we have financial regulations. I mean, you know very well, people that are involved, they know that we cannot do whatever we want with every EU euro of the EU budget that we spend. So there are indeed rules and regulations that we have to follow, whether it's for civil society organization or not, and those are the rules we need to work with. Second, though, as the Commissioner said this morning, clearly we are committed, and this is not only one delegation of one country, this is what's important to do is systematically, and the Commissioner has been pushing us and our delegations on the ground, is that systematically we do ensure when we program, but not only, also at policy level, that there is a systemic engagement with civil society organizations, again, in terms of policy dialogues, in terms of discussing the programming that we foresee in the years to come, and also in terms of providing capacities to help those organizations voice their concern in a political policy environment that's very often, as Janet describes, quite sensitive. So that's what I would say. And I would like, if we can, in the conversation, to come back specifically on inequalities, because there were also questions, SDGs and the EUVR and the Global Gateway to connect the dots.
You can do, absolutely.
Okay. Quickly,
yes.
Inequalities, and to reply to some of the questions. Inequalities, and to show that we are full-hearted trying to move on a complicated topic, as it was mentioned this morning, but at the same time, very pragmatically. And on inequalities, two things. I think inequalities is core of the policy dialogue that we're having with partner countries. There's not one discussion in our bilateral political policy dialogue that takes place where this issue doesn't come up. Again, this is politically a very sensitive issue we discussed this morning, but we also have, let's say, tools, notably through our budget support operation, to engage and raise those kind of systemic policy, taxations, domestic resource mobilization issues that are key for what we can then implement at program level. Specifically on inequalities, though, as the Commissioner mentioned this morning, and there was two questions on this, we are, this year, call for actions. We're going through all our programs for 2023 and systematically screening them all. That's the marker that the Commissioner mentioned earlier. So whatever the country and whatever the area, when we engage asking ourselves, if we do this in this country, is inequality in the picture? Are we thinking about inequality when we do this? Are we having a specific or broad objective on inequality linked to our intervention, financial interventions? Are we zooming on the bottom 40%, on vulnerability groups, on territories in that country that might be obviously behind? And do we have in place some kind of reporting and monitoring tools to do so? The idea by the end of this year is to actually have a clear benchmark, inspired, as the colleague was talking about gender, what we've been doing in the past on gender, to actually assess what our contribution does pragmatically in terms of design, but in terms of impact on the ground on inequalities. Second, and to link this...
Before you move on, so just to be clear, what you're talking about is like an inequality impact assessment for all your decision making?
It's more than this. It involves, and countries, it's difficult, hence the training we're doing this week and the discussions we're having, because you need to do impact assessment. We tell colleagues on the ground pragmatically, okay, when you do this digitalization push program in Kenya, how is it human-centered? What impact? How do you factor in inequality on this? But this is more than this. This is actually helping having inequality and the assessment in mind when we design, so that the concrete design is not only, in the case of, I'm thinking about this one right now, not only benefiting those that already have access, but those that don't. Mm-hmm. How do you rate it? Is it, a principal objective of your action target, or is it just a side, let's say, impact of your action? And how do you monitor this? I mean, how can you follow up? Based a bit on what we've been doing with more experience on gender for many years. That's what we...
It's more equality by design, implementation,
design,
and impact.
objective, and monitoring.
Okay.
So that we can know where we stand in terms of assessment. Now, very quickly, to make the links also to some of the comments. So to the question on what does that mean in terms of programs and inequalities, that's what we're trying to do this year, to have a concrete benchmark by the end of the year, on which then we can engage. Some of you are engaged, by the way, in the EU AFD research facility on inequalities. Also engage with member states and other partners. Try not only, I mean, this is the first endeavor, we want to reach out. Second and third, very quickly to make the links with SDGs and UVR, because again, SDG 10, gender equality, as this was mentioned, I think by the colleague, is not only something we care about what we do internationally, but what's key is also to connect what Europe does in all its dimensions, internal and external, to the SDGs. That's what we're doing right now with the EU voluntary review that we're preparing for the high-level political forum this summer. And the challenge there is not necessarily on the external dimension, but more on linking what we do internally with the SDGs. And finally, on Global Gateway, because again, this is, as the Commission said, I think part of the same objective. The only thing I can say is that when we do implement Global Gateway, that goes to your question, EU contribution to Global Gateway follows our financial instruments, our Global Europe instruments. So the commitments we have, whether they're on human rights, whether they're on human development, whether they are on gender, by the way, will be applied to what the EU implements through Global Gateway. We will have the same, let's say, legal context and monitoring requirements in what we do through Global Gateway. So my message is also connecting the dots. Inequality, SDGs, Global Gateway are part of the same push.
Okay. When you think about the inequality marker, interesting choice of phrasing there, but that's not meant to be pejorative in any way, is that who's going to be doing that? Is it an internal exercise, or you outsource? It's going to be internal. You're not going to get PwC or Deloitte to do it, are you?
No, we
do. Good.
We're doing it. That's why we have a full day training this week with colleagues both here and in delegations, because as we said earlier, I think people in part just as much are in delegations are obviously committed. You've seen them in Paraguay, in Bangladesh, in South Africa. They are committed, but they also need help in
You're building internal capability to do this.
Indeed.
Good to hear. Very, very good to hear. Thank you. Last but not least, give us a sense of the work that you obviously, your institute is significant in terms of kind of looking at sustainable development. Your recent work, share with us what it tells us on this agenda right now.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, happy to share some of the messages around the European Sustainable Development Network reports that we published, which is available online. Just to echo some of the points that were made, I think just to take a step back, when we did the analysis, obviously, we looked at the scale of the challenge, and just to remind ourselves that, like, this is, I mean, it feels like we're saying it all the time, but one of the key points was that for the last 20 years, it was the first time, really, that extreme poverty is on the rise again. So taking that into account and thinking of, again, the scale of the challenge, and that thinking about the SDG and the 2030 agenda, the goals seem more and more out of reach, but that should, again, be like a renewed call for action, just thinking in terms of inequalities, and inequalities not only between countries and between regions, but within countries as well, which is something that is, to some extent, new. In that global context, the EU, as EU institutions, the member states, the EIB, which is the bank, and some of the development finance institution, private sector, they occupy still a large or important place in this, especially when they can leverage collectively all of the budgets that are available, the different types of finances and themes that are being addressed. So we hear a lot about the need for more finances to tackle some of these challenges, and this is a very important point. But we also looked into the quality of this funding and how we're going to use those finances. And I think that echoes some of the points that were made earlier, that there's a need to bring more coherence to the EU ecosystem. We have the EU institutions, we have the EU member states, we also have the EIB, as I mentioned, or was mentioned earlier as well. There's been significant changes in the way that the EU architecture for international cooperation is framed and organized. The Global Europe is a significant change to bring more coherence. There's EIB Global, which is meant to be a more sort of development-focused work for the bank. But still, I mean, we understand that there are still differences in the way that the work is being done and the approach to SDG contribution and inequality is done. I'm interested in hearing about the inequality marker, and I would be interested in understanding some of the definition around that inequality and how, or to what extent that this is shared between all the different actors involved, because we're talking about multiple, I mean, we have 27 member states, all of the EU institutions, the bank, the private sector, and they might all have a different understanding of what inequality is and how they should address that. So how can we ensure that there is shared understanding so that we can also monitor progress? That's the first point. And then the second one is also about, I think we talked a lot about the assessment and getting an understanding of what has been done so that we can learn the lessons and maybe change that. I would say maybe we can also anticipate a bit better and actually think about the design, think about the sort of culture of some of these institutions so that from the very beginning, we include the thinking in terms of addressing inequalities, fighting poverty, addressing also, I think we talked about multidimensional inequalities. And at the moment at the international level, there's a lot of discussion around bridging development actors, climate focused actors, but also more finance-oriented actors, and how we can all speak the same language and have coherence between all those different approaches. We're talking about inequality, SDG, vulnerability. Are we all talking about the same thing? Because I think the last point really is about what that's going to mean from the partner country perspective. Say I'm in Paraguay, I'm in South Africa, and I'm trying to understand what all these markers are and what all these sort of concepts and terminology means in terms of access to finance, implementation, monitoring, and sort of global coherence. So to me, some of these lessons are really important to take into account. The members of European Parliament last week also called for something that maybe looks like the inequality marker, but to be applied across all EU policies. So we're talking here about INPA and maybe international cooperation and development-focused work. But the EU is much broader than that as well. So you can do something with INPA on a specific theme and topic and do something else on climate, but then you also have the trade element to it, which might undo some of the previous work done. So there's a need for more coherence in that aspect as well.
On that point, because I've managed the time hideously poorly, because I've got to finish in 12 minutes. So I need to make sure I kind of pick up pace. Can I ask you to think about, given all that you said, what's that one thing that you think should be a call, a clarion call, a kind of, not necessarily a call for action, but a call that is about saying, this will define a different way of working if we get this into the EU mandate for next year or as part of the election? What would that be?
I would say probably two things come to mind. The first one is the one that I mentioned just earlier in terms of not thinking about fighting poverty or taking inequality into account as an afterthought, but really anticipating that from the very beginning and trying to have a sort of global overview. And the second one is really to make the difference, again, at country level. So maybe we're going to talk a bit more about Global Gateway later, but I feel like a lot of confusion is around the EU trying to explain what Global Gateway is to some of the countries, where it should probably be the other way around. Like countries saying, this is how we work, this is what our processes are, how can you help supporting that? And there are multiple ways to do that, I guess.
No. I mean, let's face it, we haven't reached a world where, you know, the supply of funding matches, you know, the need of those communities on the ground. There's no balance or symmetry around that. But, you know, some places we're getting there. But it's a very good point that you make, which is recorded as a part of the emerging manifesto from Concord. Gabriele, can I come back to you? What would be the thing that you think, you know, because you said some of those, you talked about the crisis of inequality. That's diagnosing the problem. what are the couple of solutions you think should be in your call or your manifesto for the new mandate of the EU?
Yeah, I agree with my co-panelists. I think if I were able to swing the call to the European Union, the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the member states, it would be to get a global and at a European level pact on global production chains. The EU is currently working on a due diligence law. You mentioned before that we have to work with the private sector. The private sector is many different players. And parts of the private sector, the multinational corporations, the transnational corporations, are doing their very best to lobby against the climate regulations in this EU due diligence law, against the labor standards, against the human rights standards, against the civil rights standards, etc. So we, as opposed to other parts of the business community, which are social and solidarity-based kinds of enterprises, and certainly we need to work very closely with them. So my first point, my first clarion call to us as a European civil society community is get the EU to adopt a really progressive regulation, due diligence regulation on global value chains with teeth, with, you know, as much strength, and really with human rights compliance and climate change and gender justice and social justice and proper labor standards, so that we stop undermining. We have 2 billion people working in the informal economy at the end or beginning, the way you look at it, of these global production chains who are being exploited this very minute as we sit here. The other part, and that relates to it, and because we're talking also SDGs and UN level, the other part is a binding treaty that's also under negotiation, a binding treaty on business and human rights, which would do the same thing if it were accomplished at the global level. And if we had that kind of an arrangement, the EU member states, the EU-based businesses, the South-based businesses, everyone would be on the same plane, on the same normative plane, and on the same regulatory institutional plane of having to comply with human rights and all these standards that we're talking about. And then this inequality marker might actually work, because then we might actually get some forms of system change. I'm a bit skeptical about marking inequality changes without looking at systemic change that is required for inequality to change. There is this important point often made by progressive civil society, this logo of the, or this motto of the UN, leave no one behind. It sounds like accidentally people are being left behind. No, this is systemic. Yeah. This is part of how the system, how global capitalism and how hyperglobalization work. People are deliberately being left behind, and we have to tackle the system that is producing these inequalities. So I look forward to the marker, but I hope the marker will look at the systemic change that's
And I can't imagine, I mean, we'll let Philippe speak for that, but I can't imagine the marker not doing its job if it's not looking at the system. But you can come back to that. But thank you, that's really, really very helpful, and I agree with you. That phrase has become really unfortunate and proxy for so much, and no one really understands what it means in some respects. But that's a really good, thank you. In terms of your binding treaty notion, are you saying that should be some sort of multilateral institution that holds the ringer on that? Are you talking about the WTO, the UN? Who should hold the ringer on that binding? Because I like the notion of, let's say, how the EU does its trade should be a lever for passing on its values, rather than simply capital gain. Because at the moment it's about capital gain, but not about human rights and values. So what you're saying is very clearly, use your trade and free trade agreements to be a lever for positive social progress and extending your values as a EU. But who should own the binding agreement?
Okay, so the EU one would be owned by the EU Commission. I'm not quite sure about the hierarchy, how it works. The EU Parliament is currently talking about, what are the core elements that we need. And the globally binding treaty would be, the negotiations are underway at the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. The process was set in motion 7 or 8 years ago by Ecuador and South Africa, because they were subject to very, very unfair treatment when they actually introduced national legislation to curb some of the harmful practices of global TNCs. It's being negotiated in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, and if it were to come into play, it would be a UN multilateral binding, treaty binding in the sense that any country that ratifies then can be held to account to implement these standards.
Yeah. You had me until the point you said the UN. And that's not, in no disrespect, I love the UN. I just think that, no, it's not, given the meat, or rather, let's be vegetarian, the substance of what we're talking about, right? It's a trade and, much more structural issue. And it should be in the hands of either the G20 or the WTO or another agency like that. But let's have that conversation in the working groups, but come back to it, because I'm desperate running out of time.
Can I add one footnote? The EU in this multilateral negotiating process, for 7 years has been saying we cannot negotiate, we don't have a mandate. So please, let's get the EU to show up. Last time in November in Geneva, they made gave lots of ideas to the global south. This is how you should do it. But it's not about how we, the EU, maybe ought to be doing it.
Indeed. Thank you. Janet.
Okay.
The thing that you'd like to, see.
Thank you very much. I think to the EU, it's really dealing with the domestic limb when it comes to fighting inequality or contributing to equality. And for me, it's really understanding the domestic political economy of inequalities and who is sitting where when it comes to the struggles around inequality or the fight against inequality. And Gabriele has pointed one other issue I was going to talk about, at least from where I'm sitting in sub-Saharan Africa or Southern Africa, to be specific. It's the union between or amongst the business, our governments, and the different institutions that continue to perpetuate inequalities and abuse of human rights, as an example. So there's a pact around government, military, and the business that we need to deal with. And there's a lot of propaganda that comes with it, and disinformation and misinformation when it comes to the obsession around indicators. I'm excited about the inequality marker, but how it's going to go a step further in dismantling the machinery and the institutions that churn out propaganda that things are working, because the different indicators that we have seen from where we're sitting about growth. Last week I was in a meeting with our government, and we were talking about the private voluntary organization bill, which is a bill that seeks to shrink actually civil society work in Zimbabwe, registration, deregistration, and the like. And we were with the president and his team. And the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance, who responded to my presentation around the economic implications of that bill if it is passed, told the president that the economy is not fragile, it's doing very well at 5% growth. That's not an economy you would describe as fragile. He said poverty, we know that with COVID-19 in Zimbabwe, with the World Bank and others, have indicated that 49.9% of Zimbabweans live in extreme poverty, as an example. And we shared that and dismantled that. They have their own indicator or marker that they have, and they've said, no, there are no such vulnerabilities. So it was propaganda being, just spewed in front of us and to the president. And I'm just thinking, when we are talking about this human interest story around inequalities and how we're going to fight it, does the EU ensure that we don't continue to drive the narratives around economic growth that leaves so many behind, the different sectors that we have spoken about. So there's a lot of structural violence that we still need to unearth that has caused the inequalities that we saw suffering. So I think that's one of the big things that I would want to see the EU do more, is it engages, especially with governments, because there is a feeling that sometimes the EU chooses the non-confrontational, without asking the big questions around this, it chooses, the softer issues to deal with. But I think when it comes to inequalities, the big structural systemic issues that we need to address and to be bold about when we're dealing with these issues.
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much. Philippe, last but not least. It's difficult for you because you can't you're not a politician. So you can't really say, I want this for the European Commission. But, you can still have a...
I can still say two things on this.
Yeah,
and
please.
Just before, Janet, I agree. I mean, on policy dialogue, yes, I've mentioned it earlier. What we're doing on the ground is not simply financing projects hoping that they target inequalities. It is engaging in policy dialogue with the governments on difficult topics, because the domestic policies are just as important. I mean, you can have a really nice inequality frame project on the ground if the taxation system in the country, if the land system, there'll be limit impact of what we do. Janet, I agree with you. By the way, the EU last time in Geneva was actually engaged in the discussions, but we can have a separate, I don't want to continue on this, but we were actually involved in the last rounds of discussions in Geneva. And I also agree fully with Élise on, it's not only about us, EU budget into Global Gateway, but this is member states, this is EIB, EBRD, European financial institutions. So the commitments, when I say that we're taking commitments in terms of, let's say, human rights, in terms of targets, in terms of reporting about what we do, this is also something that needs also to come in a Team Europe approach when the finances are not coming from the EU budget. So I think your point is very relevant, especially when there are discussions around the reform of the World Bank and other multilateral banks. On next, two things though I think I can still say is continue to connect the dots. That's what I was also referring to what we're trying to do with the EU voluntary review, is that for the EU collectively to be credible outside, we need also to be credible inside. I mean, we're not in the business of promoting inequalities, the reduction of inequalities, gender and other key areas outside. I mean, you were talking about social contract, you were talking about what we do inside Europe obviously echoes outside. And the more we bring policies, the more we make those links, the more credible we are in continuing to, I mean, the world of 2023 is not the world of 2015, but we have an agenda that's still relevant. So the more we make those connections, the more we can then go to the high-level political forum, to the SDG summit, and more to come and continue to push for this. The second, and I think this is more for us, but I think having said this and connecting the dots, I think the challenge is still to be selective in what you do, and that's also to have impact, and that's what we're trying to do with Global Gateway. You cannot, I mean, I can't remember this movie that got all the Oscars, you're doing everything, everywhere, all at once. You can't, and so you need to connect the dots so that when we speak outside, we are credible because also of the agendas that we're running inside Europe. And at the same time, when you engage in country, it cannot be on everything, every single sector. And we need to, if we want impact, we also need to be selective. For me, those are the two issues I would like to raise.
Thank you. And Philippe, look, I don't think anybody's feeling you're a bad guy. Everyone, loves. Everyone, you have a tough job. You're standing, here. You have the commissioner do her business, and then you're there internally trying to make the system work. So everyone kind of absolutely understands what the tough job is. I think, as Jutta said, part of this job is to be tough about the challenges so that you're able to then use that opportunity internally to say, 100 organizations are telling us this, so we need to be able to think about this differently. And that's the point of civil society is to provide extra governmental levers, pressure, and a perspective on life and society that you don't get from inside. And we have to remember that. It's about healthy democracy. The one thing that kind of occurs to me is that what we're asking, I think what people are asking for is very simple mindset change in terms of the kinds of questions you ask, the kinds of collaborative practice you engage in, and how you do preventative work at the earliest stages with community, by community, rather than for community. And I think that rendition is really important to get in our minds. I've hideously run out of time. Sorry, and I'm really sorry to our organisers here. I do apologise, but it's been, I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been fun. I think one of the things that we haven't talked about is the importance of civil society for a fully functioning good democracy and a good society. We're not raising that conversation. It goes back to your point, He can say all he can about, the indicators of successful nations is GDPR, corruption reduction, or whatever, mobility, social mobility. But actually, we don't make the case for the fact that a good society is based on the quality, support, and ability of civil society to engage, because that creates a better and good society. Let me leave you with that thought. And I think it's also important that we talk about the good governance of this agenda. How do we make sure it's part of the performance indicators for a commissioner, a member of parliament, but also other agencies, that actually this becomes central to good governance. Thank you all very much. Go off to your lunch. Actually, I can't. Don't clap. Don't do anything. Tabeth and Cleese, please come to the floor, and then you can explain the working groups. Have I got the names wrong?
No, the case is not here.
Case is left. He's left the building.
He will be back.
Please. Tabeth and...
Good afternoon. I'm Tabeth Masengu, the Advocacy Coordinator at EU Court. So we've heard a lot about the Global Gateway. Commissioner Upalainen defined it as connectivity, both hard and soft, energy, infrastructure, education, health. We've heard it's a positive offer for partners with shared interests. Critics have said it's actually old wine in new skins, just repackaging. Others, actually, Vince Chadwick in his article, quoted someone saying it's geopolitics on steroids with a vengeance.
Yeah.
So there are many definitions of Global Gateway. We don't know which one to apply. What we do know is that we've got questions. Lots and lots of questions. And even parliamentarians have questions, right? Who is going to be accountable? What is a Global Gateway? Who does it reach? How much money is involved? So in the session on how the Global Gateway can deliver to equality, we're going to be delving into a small part of that. With the help of Luis from Concord, we're going to listen to a presentation, right, on inequalities and SDGs in respect of the Global Gateways. Then as working groups, we're going to try and answer 3 questions to dig deep and have recommendations that we can bring before the second panel, but also that can inform Concord policy. I mean, this Global Gateway is big, but it's like an elephant. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So we'll see you this afternoon.
Excellent.
Will be very difficult to do better than geopolitics on steroids, but I will try to also, again, as I already said before, we also have another working group where, as you could see in the video that we showed this morning, we're asking the EU to think bigger, think beyond international cooperation as well. So we've heard today that many EU policies still generate negative impacts through, for example, trade, but also the external dimension of climate policies, etc. So what can we do about it, and what tools do we have at hand? But also, how can we use our existing tools better and keep the EU accountable for commitments that they've made, even in the treaties of the European Union? So we will talk about how we can use policy coherence for sustainable development as a tool towards systemic change, as well as to hopefully help us achieve the SDGs in the next 7 years. And to reduce inequalities. So we will also be asking you in which way policy coherence for sustainable development resonates with your own work, and what challenges and systemic issues you come across in your work that undermine the efforts of both your organizations and your partners outside of the EU. So you're all very welcome to join us as well.
Excellent. So is this a kind of... Is this going to be a competition of like who goes where, or are you pre-assigned?
Looks like.
What are the
Are you pre-assigned, or you have to choose?
Rooms.
People are pre-assigned. Great. Excellent.
okay.
Oh, look. There we go.
Okay.
Your dots will indicate where you go.
Okay.
Okay, on that note, can we thank our wonderful contributors? Thank you. Thank you. And go and relax, have a bite to eat, and push your feet back, etc. You've got to 1:30, and when you go back into the working group. Thank you very much. I think lunch is out there, right? Excellent.